Bonsoir. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new session of the lab, the Laboratoire of Lyrique. Once again, I'm happy to welcome Antonio Casilli, a sociologist, professor at Telecom Paris, and researcher at the CNRS Interdisciplinary Institute of Innovation for the seminar Studying Digital Cultures, which he had been leading for quite many years now at EHESS. This is the second session of the Ethics and Artificial Intelligence series of conversations, which spans from January to June this year. And if you were not with us last time, you can find a video of that session on the Lyrique website under the title Towards a Convergence of AI Ethics. And we had the pleasure to host researcher Anna Jobin and artist and activist Paolo Cirio for it. For this session, the session which is about to start, I have the pleasure to leave you with Antonio, the French researcher Angèle Christin, and the American activist and technologist Jonathan Miller. Antonio, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Aude, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. Well, over here it's night, not for all our speakers, because Angèle is actually in California, where it's not early morning, but mid-morning. Jonathan is actually in Berlin, so we have a nice panel. I'm particularly happy to welcome you here tonight because exactly 364 days ago, we had our last face-to-face seminar of this very same series at the Lyrique, and Aude was already with us. Aude was actually the co-speaker of that. Well, now famous because it has a sentimental value for all of us. Anyways, things have changed, and we are still alive and still kicking, and but we are streaming from what seems to be our homes. And we are very happy tonight to welcome you for this double bill, double ticket, probably it's in English. So on the one side, we have Angèle Christin. I will introduce her in a second. And then after that, Jonathan Miller from the Berlin Tech Workers Coalition. Now, allow me just to quickly introduce Angèle, whom I had the pleasure to meet for the first time. I think, Angèle, it was in 2015 back in New York for a conference, and we share something because we both are products of the École de l'Institut en Sciences Sociales, because she received a PhD in sociology at the EHESS and at Princeton University, and she is now assistant professor at the Department of Communication and also affiliated to the sociology department at Stanford University. Precisely, she is also a member of the program in science and science, technology, and society. She mainly focuses on algorithms with an ethnographic angle. Well, more than an angle. That's definitely the specificity and the value of her approach. And with a couple of books, she's been able to definitely influence the field of research on algorithms and artificial intelligence. And you will see how the specificities of her approach tonight resonate with the things we have been discussing in this series. I would love to, before I yield the floor to her, just mention a couple of relevant books. The first that she published back in 2008 in French, actually, Comparution immédiate. That's the start of her research on justice, and now, of course, the research has evolved and conjugated with the algorithmic side of justice. And more recently, exactly 1 year ago, she published at Princeton University Press a book that is entitled Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms, where she makes sense, or at least helps us make sense of the way journalists have interiorized, one might say, the metrics in what they do and how they communicate and how they produce information. So for tonight, she will address let's say the starting point of our cycle of seminars, which is the ethics of AI. But then you will see that she will swiftly move to other, for some of you surprising, for some others not that surprising, and thus even more relevant topics, such as, of course, work, labor, probably one might say, and all the links that exist between these elements, these topics, and of course technology. So, Angèle, the floor is yours, and you will have up to, we said something around 30, 40 minutes, and then the floor will be for Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for this kind invitation and presentation. So for the sake of comprehension for Jonathan, we decided to do the seminar in English. So I'll be speaking English, but for people who have questions and want to ask them in French, obviously, I do understand French pretty well, and I still have a pretty strong French accent. So please bear with me on this. Americans usually find it charming. French people, I don't know. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing my screen, which, you know, is always, can be a bit of a tricky operation. 1 second. Okay, so first, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to participate in the seminar and at the Gaieté Lyrique, one of my favorite places in Paris, and get a chance to chat with Antonio, Aude, and Jonathan. So a word about myself. I'm an assistant professor of communication at Stanford, and I use qualitative methods to analyze the impact of digital technologies on the ground. Today, I'm going to be talking about algorithms in practice, from ethics to ethnography, and give you an overview of my research and why I think it's really important to do qualitative studies of algorithms and artificial intelligence. So, we live in the age of artificial intelligence. We see headlines about it all the time, usually with these kinds of pictures around it, right? So a lot of blue, a lot of code, a lot of kind of global maps of the world with like network data. You often have a picture of like typically a white woman, a young white woman, kind of in awe at like the power of artificial intelligence waiting to be saved. And so, you know, beyond this kind of descriptions, knowing that there is a whole thing to be said about the aesthetics of how we represent artificial intelligence, what we can say from a kind of sociological perspective is that the amount of data, algorithms, and analytics that are kind of regulating our daily life has been increasing exponentially over the past 20 years. So a word about definitions here. I use the three terms data, algorithms, and analytics kind of together as a kind of whole socio-technical system, but they are kind of slightly different and intertwined. So data is typically some kind of information, usually digital, usually quantitative, that is collected about us, typically through our online traces, right? Algorithms are computational procedures, usually, that turn this input data into some kind of output, sometimes using machine learning, and that's what we typically refer to as artificial intelligence, but not always. Sometimes it's just a good old regression model. And then analytics and metrics are the kind of output of these computational procedures and algorithms, and typically are kind of quantitative results that tell us something about performance, right? Though not only. And concretely, all three of them are what I study, and studying how they affect our kind of daily lives. So, unsurprisingly, the growing importance of artificial intelligence, algorithms, data, and analytics have given rise to a vibrant academic and political debate, especially in the United States, but not only, equally in Europe, that is kind of divided between several camps. And so here I just want to give an overview of what this algorithmic debate looks like to kind of better locate my intervention and where I think I differ from some of the approaches. So on the one hand, you have what can be analyzed as big data advocates, right? So typically these are the kind of vendors venture capitalists and technologists and computer scientists, all the people kind of invested in building and commercializing algorithms and artificial intelligence. And for them, looking at their discourses, which I see very often from, the beautiful city of Menlo Park and the beautiful University of Stanford, which are based in the middle of Silicon Valley, these discourses are typically that through algorithmic technologies, we can rationalize the world in an efficient and objective way. And so here, kind of looking a bit more closely, you see two versions of that kind of rationalizing argument. The first one is about kind of economic goals, where by using algorithms, we can be more efficient, we can get more information, and we can be more productive, typically. So that's the economic argument. And then the political argument, which is more about objectivity and accountability, basically saying, listen, humans have all of these biases. We make biased decisions. Why don't we rely on machines which don't have the same biases to make these kind of decisions that are very complicated to make and justify? So this is a kind of like advocate's argument. Now, over the past 10 years, there has been a kind of very different approach to this question of what are algorithmic technologies doing. And so here I will refer to this approach as FATE, which refers to fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so here, both academics and community organizers and activists and lawyers, and it's a very kind of interdisciplinary field of study, basically really take a different approach to the question of the impact of algorithms on the social world. Instead of rationalization, efficiency, and objectivity, critics say that algorithms are in fact increasing opacity, that they're opaque and unaccountable, that instead of kind of making things more transparent, they're making things less transparent, in part because no one understands how algorithms make decisions. Algorithms are kept proprietary, they rely on complex calculation techniques. Most people do not have the skills to understand how they work, so they function as black boxes that are basically kind of removing a big part of how the world works from our kind of day-to-day comprehension. The second point that they're making is that algorithms are not objective, or to put it differently, that algorithms very frequently not only mirror, but also amplify bias and discrimination. And here, kind of, one of the key kind of points here is just, and it's not surprising, seen from 2021, that algorithms typically rely on historical data. Historical data itself is shaped, produced, and mirrors long histories of social, racial, economic, and gendered, among others, inequalities and forms of discrimination. And so that under that kind of patina of objectivity, algorithms, in fact, not only reinforce, but reproduce, but also reinforce these inequalities by making them less accountable and less visible, and kind of burying them under this kind of like, kind of sugary kind of idea of objectivity, right? And so there are many calls for what's been called algorithmic accountability. So trying to find solutions for how to make these algorithms more transparent, more accountable, and more ethical. Now, what's interesting about both the kind of big data advocates and the FATE kind of approach is that in spite of their many differences, and there are very important differences in how they make sense of algorithms, there are still some interesting similarities. The first similarity is that both of these approaches tend to focus on the instruments themselves, right? So typically, they primarily look at how the algorithms themselves work, what's the kind of data that they use, what are the decisions that are made in the models, and kind of really look at that primarily without looking that much into how these algorithms work on the ground, how actual people use them in the actual world, right? So it remains pretty abstract abstract and pretty kind of removed from the messiness of the social world. Second aspect, which goes hand in hand with the abstraction, is the generalization aspect, which is that many of the people on both sides, and that comes from the kind of specific disciplines that they come from, which are mostly for the advocates, computer science, right, and engineering, and for the critics, a lot like some, not only some computer scientists, some philosophers, some legal scholars in particular, and some kind of critical data studies people, not to kind of caricature, but like a lot of these disciplines have put a premium on generalizability, right, and being able to think beyond specific domains, right, being able to kind of identify traits that are existing across domains. So this kind of generalizing aspect, which I think is really important in both cases. And finally, the third part that I think they share these two approaches, that they often take algorithmic power for granted. So by saying like, look, this algorithm mirrors inequalities or reproduces inequalities, they kind of stop there and they assume that if the algorithm exists, then it must have an impact. But without looking precisely at how this impact works out, what are some of the unintended consequences? How do people use these algorithms? How do they resist? How do they put them to their own ends? And so my research program kind of is an intervention in that debate. And instead of focusing only on instruments, I study what I call algorithms in practice. And specifically, I argue, well, a couple of things. First, algorithms are never just data, just math. They function as complex social symbols and are put to different ends. People kind of use them and make sense of them in different ways, right? That kind of takes me to my second point, which is that context matters. Depending on where the algorithms are used, on the kind of specific institutional features of the places where they're used, they're going to be taking a very different set of meanings. And this kind of leads me to the point about method, which is that in order to examine how context matters, we need to use kind of methods that are able to give us a sense of what Bourdieu and others have called the logic of practice, which is how do people work and live day to day with these technologies, right? And so that's what I've been looking at in my own research program, in which I really kind of examine the gap between the designs and actual uses of technologies. And here I'm drawing on a kind of longer tradition in science and technology studies, and examines this question of this gap between designed and actual uses through several case studies, journalism, which was the part, my book, which was published last week, criminal justice, which is the case I'm going to be talking about today, and a new research project on influencers, which is a ton of fun and which I'm in the middle of. But today I'm going to be talking about the case of criminal justice, which in some ways is the one with the most serious consequences and the most kind of dramatic forms of inequality, racism and discrimination, and lives being like actually concretely destroyed by the carceral institution. Over the past couple of years, there has been a flurry of media headlines about the role of predictive algorithms in the criminal justice system. So you can see here some of these headlines. Should prison sentences be based on crimes that haven't been committed yet? Machine bias. AI is sending people to jail and getting it wrong. Courts are using AI to sentence criminals. That must stop now. When a computer programs keep you in jail, etc. And so through these headlines and through the kind of media coverage of these predictive algorithms in criminal justice, you get a sense that this is pretty much sci-fi, a kind of dystopian future where, you know, like in Minority Report, like in Terminator, you're using these very complex and advanced technologies that are coming from the future, literally, and are telling you what are the crimes that you're going to commit in the future and using that information to sentence you in the present. Now, unsurprisingly, the situation and the actual tools are a bit more complicated than this. So What are we talking about? We're talking about predictive software programs that are called risk assessment tools that are used throughout the US and to some extent Canada, the UK, and a range of other countries. Not so much in France. So there are a couple of tools that have been developed recently, but more in the kind of civil sides and in the criminal side. These risk assessment tools do a lot of different things. They're used in pre-trial, at the moment of sentencing, but also for like jail and prison management systems and different kinds of release decisions, right? So they're used like throughout the kind of criminal justice chain. The most famous of these and the most widely used of these risk assessment tools is a tool called COMPAS for Correctional Offender Management Profiling from Alternative Sanctions. So bit of a mouthful. COMPAS is the acronym. And here I put screenshots of what the COMPAS software programs look like. So as you can see, it asks a range of questions. It's basically a survey that a social worker administers to defendants, right? And so you get a lot of different kind of information, more than 130 kind of pieces of data. Some of them are about current offenses, some of them are about criminal history, some of them are about age, gender, that kind of stuff. But some of the questions, as you may notice, are much more subjective, right, in a way. And so here, you can read the kind of top screen. Says like, tell me about your friends. Who do you spend your time with? What are they like? Have your friends ever gotten into trouble? For what? Do your parents like your friends? Why not? Do you see your friends mostly at school? And then estimate portion of used friends who, for example, sell drugs, use drugs, drink, are gang affiliated, have been arrested, etc. And once you've completed all of these questions, you can see at the bottom of that screen that there is a little button that says calculate. And once you calculate, the software programs draws on a large data set of a lot of cases, several 100,000 that have been sentenced and where they have data about recidivism to kind of compute a risk score. And you can see the lower screenshot kind of gives you the risk score. It goes from 0 to 10. 0 means that you're at a low recidivism risk, and 10 means that you're at a high recidivism risk. And then it kind of breaks it down into different kinds of risks. Now, why does this matter? It matters because it's telling us something about what the criminal justice institution and what criminal courts in general are trying to deal with. And so here, let me backtrack a tiny bit about why are criminal courts using these tools. Basically, it's not a surprise. In the American context, criminal justice is marked by a system of mass incarceration and racial bias that has been going on, well, for a very long time, since lynching and the Jim Crow kind of situation, but more recently with the rise of mass incarceration starting in the 1980s. Now, the question is, at this point, most people agree that the system needs to be reformed and that we need to put an end to mass incarceration. People agree on this question for very different reasons. For conservatives, it's mostly because mass incarceration is very expensive and is draining public budgets. And for people on the liberal and kind of more lefty side, it's mostly a question of racial and social justice and kind of fixing the kind of racial disparities in the system. It's a massive undertaking. So now, what do we do when we have a massive political problem that we don't know how to address, and one that is very complicated because, especially in the US, crime comes with a lot of emotional kind of underpinnings. And so it's always like, oh, but what if you release someone and then they go murder someone else? Like, and what if a black man and they murder a white woman? That's really terrible. Like, it kind of raises this lot of moral panics. And this is not to diminish, the emotions here, but just to say that it's a very heavy and emotional and complicated political topic. And so what do you do when you have a problem like that? Well, we kind of know the system now, especially over the past 10 years. you basically put an algorithm on it, right? In the same way that you would put an app on it. And so in that case, basically, the idea is that you would use algorithms to, and that's the ideas that Anne Milgram, for example, who used to be a prosecutor, put out, you moneyball criminal justice. You use smart statistics to change the way in which judges and prosecutors make decisions. The problem, unfortunately, is that the algorithms themselves have been found to be biased and discriminatory against African Americans. And this is an investigation that was published by Julia Engwin and her team at ProPublica in 2016, where they did a quantitative audit of Compass and showed that it was sending for equal levels of risk and actual rates of recidivism, it was being more punitive for African Americans compared to whites, which, again, is not a surprise when you think about the fact that the data that is being used to build these algorithms comes from the criminal justice system in the US starting in the 1980s, which has been showed again and again and again to discriminate against Blacks. Right? So in a way, it's really not surprising that these algorithms are reproducing the kind of patterns of discrimination that are being fed to them through the data that's being entered and used to build the models. So there has been a heated debate about this kind of like, oh, are these tools good? Are they bad? Can they be fixed? How can they be fixed? How can we make fair algorithms, etc.? But in all of these debates, there has been little to no studies of how these tools are actually being used in criminal courts. And this is where I come in. So before moving to the US, I published a book about comparution immédiate, so emergency hearings in France, and especially during the period of what's been called urban riots, émeutes urbaines, 2005-2006, in which I went to spend a year with judges and prosecutors in several criminal courts and kind of looked at how they were making decisions about cases. And so when I started hearing about these predictive algorithms in the US, I was like, I wonder, like, how are they actually used? Because based on my fieldwork in the French context, admittedly 7 years before, right, courts are not very technologically advanced places. They're mostly paper-based. They're very dusty. They're pretty dirty. I mean, it's really not a Minority Report, right? And they're very social. A lot of what goes on, and that's kind of what I show in my book, is that a lot of what goes on within criminal sentencing are these kind of fine-grained negotiations between judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, defendants. It's really this kind of complex social scene. And so how did algorithms kind of come into the pictures? And so in order to kind of address this question, I decided to conduct ethnographic fieldwork in the American context. And so I went to do interviews and observations between 2014 and 2019 in 3 different criminal courts in the United States, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in the South, and spent a lot of time with judges and prosecutors, asking them how they used and made sense of these predictive algorithms. And so based on this, what did I find? Couple of things that were pretty surprising. The first one is that, when I asked judges and prosecutors about their uses of risk assessment tools, well, first, I found that most of them were not using these tools. Or to put it a bit differently, that they had a lot of kind of resistance, a lot of pushback against this tool for a range of different reasons. First, they were saying, like, listen, I've been a judge for 30 years. I kind of know how to make decisions about my cases. And I prefer to kind of talk to the defendant in person. I don't understand why I should rely on a model and a software program that's been built by a for-profit company that I don't know, using methods I don't know, models I do not understand. I prefer to rely on my own data, right? Second aspect, they were also saying, like, listen, these tools are biased against African Americans. And so I understand that my own judgment may also be biased, but I'm not sure that replacing my own judgment by a tool that's also biased is going to make any kind of difference. And so I prefer to stick with what I know, because at least I have control over it. And so these kind of critiques of the tools were basically mirrored in how they used the tool, which is that typically they were not using the predictions of the risk assessment tools. Basically, the risk assessment tools, the risk scores were printed on a piece of paper, added to the file of the defendant, closed in the file of the defendant and never mentioned again during the hearings, right? So this kind of foot dragging where they're like, oh, yes, we're supposed to use this technology, but we don't do it. It's not worth it for us, right? Was very frequent. The second aspect that I found was gaming, that a lot of judges, prosecutors, and social workers knew very well how to tweak the variables that they were entering within the software program in order to get the outputs they wanted, right? And so they were telling me, like, listen, yes, of course, sometimes the software program will tell me that a person is high risk. Now, I look at the defendant and I've read their file and I know that, they don't seem high risks to me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tweak the variables one way or another to get the result that I want, right? And so this kind of gaming and manipulation of the tools was something they were very aware that they could do easily. I never witnessed it in person during my fieldwork, and I think it's important to mention that. But everybody said, oh, yes, we know how to do that. And the last aspect was open critiques, that they were just like very critical of these tools and basically saying, like, I don't understand why we should use them. This does not make sense to us. The second finding, which I think is really important, is that, as I mentioned, risk assessment tools and predictive algorithms are often praised as a solution to make criminal judgment and criminal sentencing more objective and accountable, right? The idea being like, oh, judges are racist, they're biased. If we use the algorithm, at least like it will give us a kind of unbiased kind of estimate and it will make things more objective. Well, what I found was that, in fact, this is not the case. And it's not the case for a variety of reasons. First, because the tools themselves are biased. Second, because the judges are not really using the tools, etc. But third, in somewhat of a perhaps more like unintended and I think more perverse and problematic way, because what I found was that the kind of discretionary power of making decisions about cases, instead of being erased, actually just is displaced to less accountable places in the organization. So why do I say that? Well, because you see, the people who are filling in risk assessment tools, so who are entering the information in the system, are in fact social workers who work in pretrial departments. So departments that are, taking care of pretrial information and justice. And these social workers are the ones who are making a lot of subjective decisions about how to enter information, how to interpret the information that the defendant is giving them, and basically how to fill up risk assessment tools, which then come up with really important effects on the kind of risk score that is being produced by the tool. So why does this matter? Well, because you see, judges and prosecutors have lots of problems. And again, some of them are very racist, some of them are very biased, but at least they take responsibility for their decisions. That's the role of the judicial professions, is that you're trained and then you exercise your role as a judge or a prosecutor, and you take responsibility for what you're doing, which means concretely that defendants can appeal the decision, right? And they can push back, and eventually you can get, sued for malpractice. It happens. Whereas if this discretionary power moves to social workers that do not put in their names, that are not trained to kind of be accountable for these decisions, well, in a way, instead of increasing accountability, it decreases it, right? And make it less easy to fix and identify. And last point that I won't spend too much time on because I want to conclude now. But that thinking about why there is so much resistance in the criminal justice context against predictive technologies, I think that some of it kind of stems from the very history and the very logic of criminal justice, where a lot is based on the rule of the precedent. It's a very conservative field for good and bad reasons, right? But it's based on previous legal bodies, previous decisions, especially in the US. And so any kind of new technology is going to be viewed with a lot of suspicion on the part of judges and prosecutors. Okay, so let me discuss this and kind of conclude. So today I've talked about my research program on algorithms in practice, and I've been talking specifically about the case of criminal justice and the uses of risk assessment tools in criminal courts in the US. And I think that here there are a couple of points that I want to emphasize, some of which relate to the question of the ethics of artificial intelligence. So the first point is that when we talk about algorithms and artificial intelligence, we must be careful not to become determinists, right? So there is this long kind of tradition in science and technology studies to push against this idea of technological determinism, that technologies have this one logic, and as soon as they're implemented, bam, like they come with predictable effects. Things are much more complicated. The uses and meanings and functions of technological tools are always negotiated with actors on the ground, right? And we see that in the case of algorithms. And so instead of thinking that just because an algorithm exists, it necessarily comes with a lot of power or a lot of kind of obvious effects, we need really to look at the concrete messiness and the details of how these algorithms are used in practice. And that means paying attention to some of their unintended consequences. So that's my first point. My second point is that I think that when thinking about how to regulate and how to change the way in which algorithms are designed, AI ethics is not quite enough. So let me be clear here. I think that AI ethics is making a range of very important points, right? And more generally, the faith, fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics logic is just really important. And right now, I think one of the most interesting and vibrant places where questions of social and racial justice in the context of technology are being discussed. Sorry. But it's not quite enough for several reasons. First, we need to move beyond abstract principles. Abstraction is what got us here in the first place, right? Abstraction is the problem here. And in particular, I'm thinking here from the standpoint of Silicon Valley, technology companies are obsessed with scale. And in order to scale up, you have to get more abstract, right? And scale is a lot of what's doing the harm here. It's erasing context, erasing fine-grained differences, erasing specificities, and in the process, hurting people and communities, workers, and different kinds of users who then end up being affected by artificial intelligence. Instead, what I suggest here is that we need to examine artificial intelligence through a different lens, not the lens of abstraction, but the lens of ethnography and kind of a more kind of engaged, and ethnography is not the only approach here, obviously, but a lens through which we listen to workers who are doing the work and the organizations that are managing the work, that goes into not only building, but also using these technologies and mediating their impact on the world, right? And so again, instead of abstract principle and generalization, I suggest paying close attention to the dynamics of resistance, power, and politics. And this leads me to the last point, which is very much inspired by kind of feminist theory and critical race studies, right? Which is that epistemology is politics. So here, this is not only about kind of an inner debate about like, oh, like I'm an ethnographer, and so I think that ethnography is just the best method, or like, oh, I'm a computer scientist, so I think that computer science is just the best method. So certainly there is a lot of bickering within academia. So there is, one has to be reflexive about that. But it's also about who gets to talk about artificial intelligence. And I think that some of the problem in artificial intelligence is what computer scientist Timnit Gebru, who was just fired in very kind of bad circumstances from Google AI ethics team, said, it's like computer science conferences typically look like a sea of dudes. It's like a sea of white guys kind of talking about code and models, right? right? That's part of the problem that got us here. And so in order to fix this problem, I'm not sure that, relying on kind of legal and philosophical principles, knowing that, legal studies and philosophies are disciplines that are as male and as white as computer science, is really going to change the kind of mindset, right? And so in order, I think, to kind of start addressing some of the questions that are being raised by artificial intelligence, one need to talk to and listen to the people who are being affected by it, the communities that are being harmed about it, and kind of looking at the messiness of how these technologies get deployed in the social world. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Angèle. Thank you so much. So now we are going to hear Jonathan Miller, as I said, an American activist and technologist, as he introduces himself, co-founder of the Berlin Tech Workers Coalition and active member of the Berlin versus Amazon movement. Quickly, the Berlin Tech Workers Coalition is a grassroots organization that empowers tech workers to build collective power and get involved in campaigns that make a positive impact on our society. And Berlin versus Amazon is a diverse island of activists, local initiatives, tech workers, artists, and local residents fighting the settlement of Amazon in the center of Berlin, and especially the Amazon Tower built in Friedrichshain. So I hope you'll share some images of their campaigns because they're quite amazing and striking. And I have to say, as a neighbor, it's always a great feeling for me to get daily reminders that despite all of the Amazon empty boxes to be found on the streets every day, there are some people thinking the big picture of this commercial model. So, Jonathan, it's up to you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. So my name is Jonathan Miller. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Slideshow. I think I'm starting. So over here is a picture of myself. I'm holding a sign that says Bezos won't save us, organize. So this was a photo from over the summer where I was showing support with the fulfillment center workers at Amazon, striking in Germany and Poland for the Black Friday season. So you can find me on Twitter and also my website at Shuga everywhere. So I have to make a confession. On a day-to-day basis, I write software for a living, and I don't actually think so much about the kind of philosophical or kind of ethical discourse, part maybe because I'm kind of jaded from the process, but also from an activist point of view, I'm a lot more interested in what Angela talked about in the A part of FATE, the accountability process. And in short, for me, that is the labor aspect. And there's a lot to say that about when we talk about mass incarceration, mass justice, and also kind of the creators, both in this technical sense of writing software, but also who are the creators of the data that is used in these processes. But before I comment on that, I'll just give you a brief introduction of the organization that I'm affiliated with. So the Tech Workers Coalition was a group that was started in 2014 as a collaboration between software engineers at Google and the service workers, so the people who, for example, clean these large campuses in the West Coast of the United States. So our mission statement is we're broadly interested in building worker power and building a more equitable society, both for the people working in these companies and also the people that are affected by these companies. So the users of Facebook, the people whose data is used for this. But the Tech Workers Coalition was started in Silicon Valley in the West Coast. It's not exclusive. It's not limited to there. So we're a global movement. So I myself am from New York City originally, based here in Berlin, and we have chapters in many of the typical tech hubs around the world. So that includes Bangalore in India, London, United Kingdom, Montreal, Amsterdam, and I'm very excited to announce starting in April, we'll be launching a new chapter in Munich in Germany, which is the auto capital. So what is Tech Workers Coalition? We're not a union, I need to say that outright. We're, and while in every city is different, we're volunteer based. So for the Berlin, which is the city I can speak best to, we work with unions. So you have the kind of main union affiliates of the German Confederation, so Service Union, Metal Workers Union, and NGG is the Food and Beverage Union. So a lot of the platform workers at, for example. So one area where I'm really passionate about, and it's I think it doesn't really exist in the United States, but it's quite common in Europe, in France, in Germany, is the worker representations, worker representative bodies, so works councils. And of course, through conferences like this, we collaborate with academics. Just about 3 hours ago, I was hosting a meeting with the Berlin Tech Workers Coalition and the German Labor Ministry, because in Germany we'll be announcing some new legislations regarding platform economy. So we do also lobbying or advocacy there. So before we move forward also with kind of tech worker organizing, there's kind of the question, which is, who are tech workers? And there's a really wonderful essay, which I would recommend all of you read, by Ben Tarnoff, called The Making of the Tech Worker Movement. It's also published in the Logic magazine. And, of course, people who write software are typically people who look like me, white cis dudes are the first image people have when they think of tech workers. But I also want to kind of broaden that. So as I mentioned earlier, the Tech Workers Coalition was founded by Google software engineers and service tech workers, so the people who make the daily jobs of software engineers possible. So that includes bus drivers, security contractors, cleaners, and then the second category is, of course, office-based workers. So at Amazon, for example, they don't talk about tech and non-tech workers. Instead, they talk about a kind of warehouse and office-based workers. And office workers can include everything from the stereotypical workers, so the people who work on, for example, Amazon Web Services, the giant software suites that Amazon has and also sells to other tech companies. But can also include very informalized office-based workers. So that's everything from outsourced contractors to, for example, the people who are labeling the data, or contact center workers, so customer service, people are providing audio support. And that those sectors also typically are much more feminized and non-white, but still working in an office. So I also don't want to have this kind of false dichotomy of blue-collar workers as oppressed or lower paid, and white-collar workers, sitting in office desks as being higher paid or with better working conditions, because that dichotomy is also just wrong. And then you have, of course, gig workers. So gig workers, depending on the country and the company, can include everything from very informalized freelancer status to highly qualified employee status, but still working gig to gig. And that will also vary. And then section on commerce, which is kind of the technical area or the branch sector that we categorize in labor movement. So people who sell stuff, and logistics, so working in fulfillment centers, warehouses, which Amazon is known for. It's a logo of the Berlin Tech Workers Coalition. So typically what happens in Tech Workers Coalition in a typical month is we'll have trainings on, for example, how to form works councils. If you've ever visited Berlin or read the news about Berlin, you know that gentrification is one of the biggest issues, and that's kind of also the impetus in which the Berlin versus Amazon campaign came. So Amazon is, of course, headquartered in Washington State in Bellevue, but around the world they are setting up different offices. And so in Berlin, they currently have 3 different offices. And so these are kind of like white-collar office-based offices, but they want to build up what will become the biggest building in all of Berlin. It will be a 140-meter tall building called the Amazon Tower. And that's being opposed by primarily anti-gentrification activists, and that includes cultural workers, artists, neighborhood, community-based organizations, and also tech workers. So we talk a lot about the kind of property-tech relations, and that's a whole category in and of itself. Everything from the kind of speculative market, because tech companies actually know a lot more, have a lot more data about the speculative market than the people who could hold these real estate giants accountable. We have learning clubs. So, as tech workers and as non-academics, we don't always have the luxury of, attending academic panels or university. So in the evening time, we typically hold these learning groups where we discuss different essays or concepts, conducting also things like workers' inquiries, where we're exploring the experiences that we have on a day-to-day basis. So where this comes in is typically when people think about the labor movement, we think about very classic kind of shop floor issues of, wages, safety conditions, and those are really important, especially during times of Corona. But tech worker movement is also quite concerned with kind of broader social issues. So these are some select images I've selected on the top left, you have this common slogan, tech won't build it, which is kind of a pledge and a demand that tech workers have to not be complicit in, for example, the military-industrial complex or other carceral institutions. On the top right, you have Salesforce, which it was recently published in the news that Salesforce was having contracts with one of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security agencies. And the CEO of Salesforce, Mark Benioff, he's kind of one of the exceptional tech CEOs. His brand is a do-gooder CEO. So his company was really famous for withdrawing from Indiana when Indiana was hosting anti-gay legislation. And so Mark Benioff is kind of one of those self-described progressive tech CEOs in California, and yet still his company, Salesforce, as they call it, Cageforce, was collaborating with Customs and Border Protection, which is a sub-agency of Department of Homeland Security. On the bottom is a kind of a punny slogan, "The wrong Amazon is burning." And this is from September 2019 during the climate strike, which some of you may have attended. It was also the largest tech convergence of tech companies and tech workers marching against climate change. One particular group that was behind this was the Amazonians for Climate Justice. And these are primarily office-based Amazon employees who've been bringing demands, that by the year 2030, that big tech companies, whether it's Microsoft, Amazon, Google, or Alphabet, that they become carbon neutral. Instead, in the case of Amazon, one of the organizers, Emily Cunningham, she was fired this past summer, so almost a year ago. And as a result, a number of other people have stepped up to organizing. And in one case, Tim Bray, the vice president of Amazon Web Services, he resigned as a result. So it's very much a situation that's in flux. And so this is, I don't speak Italian, so I'm not going to try to translate. This is an image from the Tech Workers Coalition. And for all of you who are sitting in offices or desks, this is an inspirational message to rise up. So you have a person on the left kind of slouched over. Myself, I can definitely see myself in that. But to rise up when you get organized, when you have a more accountable structure. And by organized, it also means both building accountable institutions, but also realizing that we're not alienated in the kind of frustrations or the questions we have of broader society. So it's about also building solidarity and finding affinity with one another. And in the United Kingdom, and a major contrast from the United States, labor laws work quite differently. In the United Kingdom, the Tech Workers Coalition chapter of London founded a sectoral branch in the Communication Workers Union, which is like the UK affiliate of Communication Workers of America. And over there, they're interested in, again, a very broad definition of what is a tech worker, welcoming anyone who works in the tech sectors. And so, yeah, in short, tech won't save us. This was my very brief demo, but I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'm going to give some comments on what Angela was talking about. So as I was listening to this presentation, I realized, so on a daily basis, I work regularly with algorithmic processes, and I definitely create and perpetuate bias. There's no doubt about that. But I don't really think too much about it, and I think it's partly by design. But also, for example, so I work in the payment team in my own company. So I work with payment services, and one payment service provider is called Stripe. What Stripe allows someone like myself to do is to avoid the liability or responsibility of directly handling credit cards. So even if I wanted to, I don't see any of the credit card information. And that's arguably a good thing, because in this case, I don't have to worry about being biased or misusing this credit card information. On the other hand, for example, one of the processes or things I do is blocking users in my mobility company for fraudulent behavior. What does the fraudulent behavior exactly entail? I really don't know. All I know at this point is that Stripe assigns a credit score between 0 and 99, and I can decide if 70 is risky enough or if 50 is risky enough. So that's partly a business decision. But as to the question of how Stripe assigned a score of 70 or not, I really don't know. And so is there racialized bias? Is there kind of redlining or anti-gentrification behavior? I don't know. Now, in this case, if we make the wrong call, I could justify that at worst case, no one is going to jail over this. At worst case scenario, they're not able to use our service as a consumer, since this is a non-essential service and I don't have an essential job, I'm essentially, I don't feel too bad about that per se. But then when we're talking about things like mass incarceration or access to housing or health, these are really important questions. And this is a topic that comes up a lot, and our organizing workers are really interested in both knowing how they can enforce their own rights in their own workplaces. So, and this is an area where in the different countries we talk to, a lot of the laws have not caught up. So in Germany, for example, they're only recently or now talking about, for example, the enforcement of AI in both workplace monitoring, but also AI in terms of the company's products. There isn't any codified laws about what algorithmic transparency is or means. And it's not always easy, to kind of conceptualize that. When we talk about kind of dating platforms, a lot of people have the question of how do the algorithms work? But before we had dating websites, you had to kind of maybe the parental algorithm. I didn't always know if it was fair or not, but at least it was clear who was creating the inputs for that algorithm. So in this whole kind of debate or discussion about the usage of predictive policing or predictive technologies in mass incarceration, one question I have, and it's a bit of a philosophical question, if the predictive policing is imperfect or biased today, that does imply or raise the question that predictive policing could become more accurate in the future. And then is the question that then it would be okay or acceptable to replace with whatever system we have with that. And I reject that premise because fundamentally I think the mass incarceration system is a racist system. It predominantly is punitive and targets people who don't look like me, so transgender people, people of color, especially Black men. And in the labor movement, this is also an issue. So 1 year ago, I was in campaign to organize digital employees. It's the union that organized the Alphabet Workers Union. We were having these conversations where, so on one hand, Alphabet workers were talking about the work they were doing against militarism or kind of their complicity in projects like Project Maven, which was a military project to scan and improve drone aerial footage. What's interesting is in 2018, many of the Alphabet or the Google workers didn't know that they were part of this Project Maven because they're so kind of separated or isolated from this process. So many of them who were in the project only found out after it was published in the news, and then they realized their connection with it. But when they were talking about labor organizing, what they realized is that the labor movement itself benefits from mass incarceration. So, for example, in most countries, including France and the United Kingdom and the United States, most prison officials are a member of a union. And for complex reasons, in the case of the US, the Communication Workers America, which is typically a private union, typically represents private sector workers. They also represent public sector workers. And so from that labor point, they were opposing the privatization of prisons because private prisons would, in many ways, represent decreased accountability. But at the same time, then the implicit argument is that public prisons are fair or at least better. And I think it's not the debate I want to have. But we were talking about that because there's kind of this tension where the public sector prison guards were being represented by a union, but the prisoners, and many prisoners are also workers, they did not have this luxury of being represented by unions. And so that was a big point of tension a year ago when we were talking with them. What I think is a positive, and in the summer you had a kind of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests and demos. And one thing that sprung out of that in the United States labor movement is cops out of unions, because you have some of the largest unions include police officers. And I think this is an interesting area where the tech worker movement can also play a role. So we're both a very militarized industry, but also many of the labor militants are really opposed to this and having police in the labor movement. I'll keep it short here, and we can start in a discussion.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Maybe Antonio, yeah, you want to say something already?
Yes, as the official organizer, I have the privilege, which I of course intend to benefit from, to open the dances and to start with a couple of questions for both of you. And this is from on the one side to allow those who want to ask questions through the chat to regroup, write down the question, and of course our valiant and extremely attentive colleagues at the Gaieté Lyrique will do their best to convey the question in our direction. And of course it's also to bring together both of your presentations, which were different in nature, because of course each one came with their own baggage of knowledge and questions and topics that are the topics that you deal with every day. But we also have to make those contribution of yours resonate with the main question that is overarching on these cycles of seminars, which is how can we come up with a thorough analysis of the ethics of AI, and how which each one of you does in their own corner can provide us with insights. So this is just again to explain why I will ask these questions. So the first one is for Angèle, and it has to do with many of the points you raised in your presentation. Mainly, I think that the presentation was extremely important to make us understand that professional logics matter in establishing how AI are used. In your case, social workers and of course judges play an important role, sometimes in using, sometimes in not using, sometimes in gaming the algorithm. And this is something that is extremely interesting, and by the way resonates with one of the, let's say, threads of my own research. When we study gig workers who interiorize Uber or Deliveroo's algorithms in order to maximize their profit, or what they gain actually, and on the other side to minimize the hustle and the time that they devote to the actual task. This is something that seems to be the same kind of professional logic that factors in the way AI is used. But the main question is actually about how professional logics can influence the way we envision the ethics of AI, not only AI every day, not only the use, the deployment of AI. And this is something that you mentioned to Angèle when you said that there is a difference between the Silicon Valley approach to the ethics of AI and the philosophical or more, let's say, socially oriented or humanistically oriented approach to this. And this brought to my mind a very recent contribution that was presented at a conference that you are aware of, which is called FACT. FACT stands for Fairness, Accountability and Transparency. And it's a big conference for those who are dealing with the ethics of AI. This article was presented by Deborah Raji and her colleagues, and the title is "You Can't Sit With Us: Exclusionary Pedagogy in AI Ethics Education," and deals with specifically the way AI is taught in university and schools, and makes a very interesting point that there is definitely a split between the CS, the computer science approach to it, and the humanistic approach to it. And these two fields of knowledge do not talk to each other and largely despise each other. They do not consider the added value that can come from interacting on the one side with software engineers when you are a philosopher, for instance, or an ethicist, or on the other side, if you are a computer scientist or a data scientist. What can these humanistic sciences provide you? So I just wanted to know, what do you think about how this kind of professional logics, which manifest themselves as disciplinary gaps between hard sciences and what soft ones, probably, I'm not even sure, and how they influence not only how AI is used, but also AI ethics is construed. So this is the question. I probably might shut up now and ask Jonathan his question after you, Angèle, if you are right.
Yes, great question. So listen, I think that, yes, okay. So I think that education and kind of professional norms play a really important role in how this question of ethics and of political change, right, basically, are going to happen. And that's the reason why I think I was so interested in hearing what Jonathan was saying, because I think that the Tech Worker Coalition is doing a lot of that work at the professional, in the kind of work context, right? And they do that in several ways. Like some of it is like consciousness raising. Some of this is like understanding that tech workers are not only white collar workers, they're not only computer scientists, right? That it's much more distributed. There are like so many different levels of skills, and kind of bringing all of this together. And I think this makes me kind of think also about Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri's book Ghost Work, where they show that like artificial intelligence in most cases is people. It's made of people. In most cases, like Amazon Mechanical Turk workers who are coding all of that stuff. And that's what we call artificial intelligence. It's the work of actual people who like kind of made all of this possible, right? And so I think that's a kind of boundary displacement that the Tech Worker Coalition is doing is just really fantastic in kind of changing the paradigm of like of what like tech workers understand as possible and understand themselves as responsible for. So like I just wanted to put that here, as something that I think is really important. Now, within the realm of academia, and specifically of Stanford University, which is where I teach, and which like has one of the kind of biggest and most prestigious computer science departments, and provides, there is kind of this direct pipeline between Stanford and Silicon Valley for a mix of historical and geographic reasons. The connections between Silicon Valley and Stanford are very deep and very numerous and very important. And I think that it's really interesting to witness some of the development. So like typically, in my case, and like this is not to praise my own chapel, it's just because this is what I know best. I teach this like very big undergraduate class called The Politics of Algorithms. In which basically I have students, I have usually between 100 and 200, 150 and 200 students. Half of them come from computer science and engineering, and half of them come from the social sciences and the humanities, right? And basically the syllabus, so the readings kind of, give a sense of that continuum, that like I both have a computer science paper, statistics paper, like pretty kind of computationally heavy papers, and then I also have I have them read like Foucault and like Goffman and like all of that stuff. And what's really interesting in that kind of context is seeing the discussions can be very heavy and it can be pretty conflictual, actually, which, as a professor is always some things that it's always this kind of added kind of thing where I was like, okay, how do I manage this? But what's really fascinating is seeing the fact that like both the kind of on the kind of the more like computer science heavy people and the kind of social science and humanists kind of develop a common language over the course of the quarter for talking about some of these questions, right? And so I have them work in groups and we try to kind of match the students and have different disciplinary approaches within each kind of group. And so that, but then even more interesting is seeing afterwards the fact that, a lot of students email me. So I started teaching this class 5 years ago. And many of the students have already graduated, they already work in industry, and it's just like kind of seeing their emails 2, 3, 4, 5 years after they took the class saying like, hey, I'm creating a startup for like biomedical devices, we're using artificial intelligence, like could you send me like 3 references of papers that raise like the question of like ethics and fairness, because I don't know how to deal with any of that stuff, and I remember the class we took together, and I know there are problems here that I'm not seeing. And so, it's like this kind of small kind of thing, but it's like at my modest level, I'm just like, yeah, this is exactly, it's like being able to ask or being able to see what you don't see. Right? It's like the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns. It's like, at least here, there is like a sense that there is a known unknown, right? And so that's something that I find really fascinating. I will say the same thing about FACT. So the conference on fairness, accountability, and transparency, we actually ended yesterday, and where I was a moderator and a panel organizer and a chair and a RIA chair. Anyway, I've been doing a lot of FACT. But I think that what's fascinating about these conferences is that they're also trading zones between very different disciplinary approaches and really worldviews, between like, hey, what's the best way to optimize this algorithm, right? And like people on the other side being like, you are doing data violence right now. The very method that you're using is actually erasing voices and is part of the problem. And seeing these discussions, which again can be pretty heated, and I've just witnessed this, so this is very fresh in my mind. I think that a lot of what's happening in these places and in other places like, AI Now, Data and Society, the Tech Worker Coalition, is kind of bringing together people to kind of at least start to develop a common language for talking about some of the problems, the harms, and some of the solutions, I think.
Thank you very much, Angèle. This is extremely important, also because you provided your own experience as an academic, and how sometimes we are involved, and I'm using this word by design, in the construction or even probably in the social construct that is the ethics of AI. Because whenever a student of ours, it can be yours, it can also be mine, it happens to me too, ask for those 3 references, we are pretty much sure that, first of all, yes, they are motivated by probably a good intention, but also that there is also a utilitaristic approach to those, because these 3 references are probably important for them to have the ethical approval that they so desperately need in order to have that second round of fundings and stuff like that. So in a way, we do find ourselves in a situation which is sometimes extremely complicated whenever we do what we do, meaning whenever we just do our job. And this is also, okay, not so smooth transition to the question I was going to ask Jonathan. Yesterday, your website, techworkerscoalition.org, published an interesting, we would say a témoignage, which is a first-person account of a Turk. Now, this is not something that you, Jonathan, might be aware of, but people who attend this seminar are, I am extremely interested in the work of people like Turkers, and we've been doing big inquiries, workers' inquiries in France and now we are working on African data workers and South American data workers. So this is something that is extremely vivid to me. Now, my point is actually, where do we draw the line of what we describe as tech work? And you mentioned this essay, which I recommended and I shared in the chat, called The Making of the Tech Worker Movement by Ben Tarnoff, published in Logic magazine. In one part, Tarnoff mentions also the fact that data labelers, which are described somewhat inaccurately as office workers. They are not always working from their office. Sometimes they're working from home. Sometimes they're working even from strange and in unexpected places, rural India or cyber cafes in Indonesia and stuff like that. Anyways, they are tech workers. Now, the real question is, again, when we talk about the frontier between tech workers and the rest of the world, should we or not, in your opinion, include also prosumers or simple users? And this is something that was brought to my attention, first of all, because yes, of course, I've been studying it for 5 years now, the role of the prosumers in the creation and generation of this data, and also in the annotation. I mean, people on Instagram go on tagging images every day, exactly like people who do data labeling and semantic segmentation. Yet, when they, as they did recently, want to be included in big initiatives like the AW, so the Alphabet Workers Union, I know for a fact that some prosumers got in touch with the AW and said, listen, I produce data because I do recaptures. So I should, by your definition, your inclusive definition, be considered as an Alphabet worker. Does your union include me? So the same question is, despite the fact that the Tech Worker Coalition is not a union, does, in your opinion, these people should be involved in your process, in the process that you're leading? And how does this change from country to country? Because I know you're based in Berlin. Every chapter has a specific situation, that every chapter of the Tech Workers Coalition has a specific situation that they're facing. So how does this modulates all over the world?
Thank you for that question. That's really also philosophically really important. And before I give you my personal answer, first of all, even if I had the perfect or correct answer, if none of the so-called workers that I think are workers would agree with me, then this kind of identification doesn't really work. So the self-identification is quite important. So first and foremost, I would argue I'm not actually as concerned with who is or isn't a tech worker. Fundamentally, I think worker solidarity is important. One reason why I think strategically tech worker identification is interesting or important is, one is I think tech has this hype. And so if tech workers can use that hype to advance labor rights, then that's a good thing. And also, I think it's necessary to counteract decades of Californian ideology that has convinced people working in the tech industry that are not actually workers, but they're entrepreneurs, they're creatives, they're people who transcend any of the realities of work. And I think if you, feminist literature, feminist theories of labor can also examines this debate of what is work and what is not considered work. So most of the time when we're talking about work, we're talking about kind of productive work, so work that directly benefits shareholders or has a salaried income. But also, as I mentioned, for example, we talk about service workers. Service workers kind of occupy this dual space of both being productive workers. You know, a janitor is paid for the janitorial work, but that work enables other workers to do what they do. And so similarly, you know, this question you raised about CAPTCHA, and CAPTCHA is a technology that's owned by Google. So it is a relevant question of, should anyone who ever logged into a browser and fills in the CAPTCHAs and helps identify images, should they be categorized as a Googler or a tech worker? It's an interesting question because most people who use CAPTCHAs are not explicitly paid for this. And in this area of, and there's this whole taxonomy or proposals of what's called data unions. And they don't mean union in the classic sense of, you have a membership card, but they more the identity as consumers. We provide this data, and so either we could take more control in terms of withholding that data, or at least monetize it and get paid for it. And in a very practical way, this could be done through your browser. So every time you log into a browser or visit a website, if your data is used, then you should get compensated. I know the Brave browser wants to implement this, and it's something that Jaron Lanier talks a lot about. I think tactically it's a very interesting area to look at kind of consumer advocacy, whether it's boycotts, in the classic sense of boycott, don't shop, or thinking about data as this consumer good. I think all of these questions are not really ethical questions, but are more tactical questions. And so also the question of who is a worker, I would save that for the lawyer. To give you a beautiful example, in Germany right now, you have this kind of sectoral bargaining where Amazon workers are categorized by Amazon Germany as logistics workers. But the German trade unions, Verdi wants to recategorize them as the commerce sector because the collective bargaining agreement there is stronger. In Italy, on the other hand, you have kind of the converse situation where Amazon Italy is categorizing the workers as logistics workers. Sorry, I'm mixing that up. Point is, it's the reverse. So intuitively, which one is correct? I think they're all correct, but I'll save that for the lawyers in terms of who is or isn't a worker. I think one area where it does get very interesting is like when you talk about the data labeling. So CAPTCHA is not paid, and most people who do fill in CAPTCHAs wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as workers. But you have two kinds of data labelers in terms of contracts. So earlier today, I mentioned I was at a meeting with the German Ministry of Labor. We also had a person who works as a data labeler at the Amazon audio service Alexa. The kind of work this person does is as a full-time employee of Amazon. And then on the flip side, you have this service that Amazon does. It uses it internally, but it also makes it possible for other companies to benefit from Amazon's AI expertise called Mechanical Turk. And for Mechanical Turk, the employer is legally an ambiguous area. It's people who provide kind of human intelligence tasks, or the acronym HIT. So people who provide hits, and it could be everything from tasks like translating content to identifying triangles in a picture. And the people who fulfill these tasks are nicknamed Turkers. So this is a very highly surveilled, highly controlled environment, and very quantitatively performance oriented. So there's a wonderful group was started by Lily Irani, who I know will be presenting at this conference soon. But Lily Irani, who's referenced in this article that I posted, she co-founded this project called the Turkopticon. And so when we talk about kind of the surveillance from top down, workers are able to kind of reverse that in something like a sousveillance, where they re-examine the gaze. So rather than looking at the Turkers or the workers who are performing all these tasks, Turkopticon is a browser extension that recreates a database of the people who provide these hit tasks. And so it allows the workers to assess the people who are providing these different tasks. And it also provides a social forum where Turkers can provide solidarity with each other. So from a legal point of view, they're not necessarily classified as employees. They're not classified as a union. But the principle of solidarity is there. And I think that's the most important thing. The rest of the discussion is about tactics, strategies, maybe framing. The last point I'll bring is so I think a lot of platform or online crowd work does bring up a lot of these tensions and kind of the definitions of work. And so in Germany, you have the YouTube Content Creators Union. So these are people who are influencers. They make money from advertisements on YouTube from the videos they post as part of the YouTube influencer program. And in the United States, you have recently SAG-AFTRA's the most famous actors union. If you want to be an actor, you have to be a member of SAG-AFTRA. And I know Meghan Markle used to be part of them, if you watched that whole interview with Oprah the other day. But SAG-AFTRA recently expanded their membership requirements. So now SAG-AFTRA is paving the way in the United States for Instagram influencers, TikTok influencers. And so I think the redefinition, the re-social conceptualization of work is happening, and I'm excited to see that. So as long as you're not a police officer doing active harm to others, I think you should be you are a worker, and you should have a voice.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. These are all very relevant elements that you added to this conversation. Before I know that Aude wanted to ask a question, but I also see that the questions are piling up in the chat, or probably it's just. I'm sorry. Did I hope I did not interrupt you. So, Aude, what do we want to do? Do we want to read a question and then you ask yours, or do you want to go first?
No, we can start with the audience, of course.
Okay, so let's start with the first one I can see on my side for Angèle. Can we have more details on the social workers feeding the algorithm?
Yeah. Sure. So basically, okay. So the way in which criminal courts are organized, typically, is that you can think about them as like a series of like departments, right? So you have each kind of judge, or it's different in France and in the US, but in the US, like each judge has their own court, and then so you have all of these judges that have all of their own courts, right? And then you have prosecutors, district attorneys, and assistant district attorneys that kind of feed defendants into the different kind of courts, depending on the nature of the case, which court has open spots. I mean, it's basically the logistics of cases is kind of how it works, right? And then you have social workers that work in what's called the pretrial service department or pretrial justice department, which is basically an independent-ish kind of structure within the kind of larger umbrella of the criminal court. That's basically whose job it is to build or to put together the information that both prosecutors and judges and defense attorneys are going to be looking at. So they're the ones who are in touch with kind of defendant's family, typically, or the defense attorneys, to kind of get, proofs of employment, proofs of residence, proof if you're a parent, all of that. And they kind of compile all of the information. In France, like some of that work is done by the juge des libertés et de la détention. So that's kind of a bit of a similar thing, so not completely. But they're the ones who kind of build the file, right? So that's kind of what they do. They get the sheets from the police department. They kind of put it all together. And so as part of part of this work, that's where risk assessment tools come in. Because as part of kind of compiling that information, compiling the file of a given defendant, they're the ones who kind of put together the information, enter it in the risk assessment tool, and then kind of print out the sheet or whatever, add it to the file with the scores. They're also the ones who do preliminary interviews with the defendant. So these are typically kind of pre-trial interviews where, the idea is that you're trying to get as much information as you can about the defendant in order to decide whether it's a problem or not to release them before the trial. Because the way it works is that typically, say you're arrested by the police, you have whatever, in France it's 48 hours, or but you have a window of time where you're under arrest, and then you're charged. If it moves towards charges, you're charged by the prosecutor, right? But then between the moment when you're charged and the moment when your trial or when your hearing happens, there can be a long window of time, like a window that goes from like a couple of days to like a couple of months to like a couple of years even, in some cases. And so the question is, what do you do with the defendants during that window of time? And so what's a pretrial? Sorry, I realize this is a rambling question, but like I can't stop when I get started on this question. So and so basically the question is like, do you release the defendant and everybody wants, I mean, you know, that's kind of better, because the idea is that like that way they don't lose their job, they're not in jail. They, you know, if they're parents, it's incredibly disruptive. If they have, if they're caregivers, it's incredibly disruptive. So it's also incredibly disruptive for non-caregivers. It's incredibly disruptive, period. It's just like, it's basically you're ruining people's life without having even decided whether they were guilty or not, right? So pre-trial is really this kind of really important window. And so as part of this, that's when they're kind of collecting the information for risk assessment tools. Sorry, that was rambling. But yes, that's the situation for social workers. And so when which social workers are trained, typically in the US, they have a social work degree, but it means also that they have not necessarily been trained specifically in criminal justice stuff, nor in algorithmic fairness, right? And that's like, again, where the question of professionalization and professional logics kind of emerges. That I think that a lot of the kind of legal and social work education has to change to kind of create safeguards and kind of reflexes about how to deal with oppressive algorithmic systems. And here I'm thinking, for example, of the book of Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, where she looks at how social services in the US, especially child protective services, yes, thank you, Antonio, have been automated, and how social workers are basically kind of not trained and kind of powerless. I mean, not as powerless as the actual people being categorized and oppressed by the system, but that they have little recourse in kind of fixing the mistakes and the automation of the kind of large case management systems that they're dealing with. And so again, that goes back to the question of professionalization and education, but I think it's an important one.
It was not a rambling answer at all, because actually this allowed you also to provide some answers to another question which was asked in the chat about the differences between the US and the French system. So it's covered. That's very good. So Odd, it's now the time for you to ask the question.
I have a question for Jonathan, actually, following the publication in the Tech Workers Coalition newsletter last month of their report about the tech companies building weapons for war. And I just wanted to know if it got in touch with some of the workers of the coalition, and what were the reactions. I mean, there have been also, of course, workers' movements sparking from such issues in the past years, but I wanted to know if this specific report also sparked some new awareness, and what was the conversation around this? Yeah.
Can you repeat the question? Which coalition?
The Tech Workers Coalition, the general.
Or sorry, rephrase the question entirely. There was some lag on my end, I think.
Okay. So in the Tech Workers Coalition newsletter last month, that published a report about the tech companies building weapons for war. And I wanted to know what were the reactions of the workers of these companies, of course, knowing that there has already been some workers' movements sparking from such issues in the past years. But yeah, if this specific report sparked some new awareness among the workers also.
I think the kind of the reactions you get is mixed, depending also on the kind of the level of consciousness that workers have. So some find a kind of a sense of relief, you know, that they're not alone, or that there are kind of the sense of progress, or at least a kind of a raised social debate or discussions in society, but also amongst workers themselves. And then you have others who I think are kind of in either absolute denial, or kind of in these different phases of rationalization, where they, you know, either rationalize that they're either the specific company or the job that they have, they're not complicit or responsible, or a kind of rationalization that it's not all that bad. So I think the reactions are quite varied. So there is a kind of the echo bubble, like when we talk about tech workers against militarism, talk about, you know, anti-capitalists, leftists, but then you also have many workers who are fundamentally concerned with kind of bread and butter issues, and their bread and butter issues might be, you know, I want that movie night on Friday, or I just want like a stress-free environment, and so not necessarily always caring about these broader social issues. So I think that's the less rosy, more honest answer.
And this also has to do, Jonathan, with the what in another conversation we had can be described as a top-down organization of a workers' union or a workers' organization such as yours. Because whenever you have a more vertical structure, they tend to concentrate on high impact, but bigger and sometimes even abstract, with less related to movie night or I don't know well, how much you earn at the end of the month. So in this case, it also has to this kind of topic, or this kind of grievance more is tend to attract a certain type of union, isn't it?
I mean, I would agree with that on the onset. I mean, I think there was a kind of a question that Timnit Gebru, one of the AI researchers and recent Googlers, was fired by Google. She asked this question, which is, you know, if unions have corporate-like tendencies, what are the differences? And, you know, she was acknowledging there was a qualifier. She wasn't equating the two. And then some people discussing talking points. So I think what all unions have generally in common. I mean, I think there are some bad examples, bad unions, like the Christian unions in Germany, which fundamentally exist more as a legal hack. But generally, most unions around the world, what they have in common is they do have some kind of democratic structure. You know, you have a bunch of members, they elect some leadership. It might still be a very centralized process, but in theory, it's democratic. And it's for the benefit of the workers. That said, and I think sometimes it's done out of laziness or kind of a lack of resources, but you have this kind of top-down mandate of kind of a consultancy or experts, you know, paving the way with legislation. You especially see this in the gig economy discourse, where you have kind of in the United States, sectoral bargaining is being proposed without the input or the interest of involving gig workers themselves. These kind of backdoor dealings between certain unions and tech companies like Uber. But that said, I think the experience of like democracy of workers engaging in their own workplace it's not something that happens overnight. And so I can say, you know, it's a good thing. But the question is, do people want to put in this level of effort into organizing, into on a daily basis making decisions? And there are certain things, you know, what color a t-shirt is, I don't care. I trust someone else to make that decision for me. But in a sense, that also means it isn't 100% democratic, right? What I think is important is, so there's kind of the passive consent or the implicit consent when people or unions or organizations are doing things. But what are the mechanisms or the mechanisms of control to say no or to recall leadership? And I think that part is really important. And I think of this both when we're talking about kind of labor organizing, but also when we're just talking about AI and the usage of it. I think the right to participate is important, but also the choice to opt out or not participate is equally, if not more important.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. The next question is actually for Angèle. I will rephrase it slightly. It comes from the chat room. And the question is actually about something that you did not address, because you made it sufficiently clear that either while working on journalism or in the courts, you were actually working on users and how metrics or algorithms or these solutions are used by social workers, judges, and so on and so on. But the question is actually about references and possibly insights coming from ethnographic work on computer scientists developing AI. And the actual question, the way it is phrased in chat is, did you meet people developing Compass, for example? By the way, I want to remind that there is a drinking game going on. Whenever the word Compass is mentioned, you have to take a sip. So, Angèle, what can we say about the other side of the ethnographic work that either you or a colleague of yours have been doing?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. As part of the work I did at Data and Society, we tried to reach out, which was more like on the kind of policy side, where we tried to map like all the risk assessment tools that were being used, all the variables that they were kind of using, the kind of data, the decisions that were made about models, and kind of getting a sense of how they were developed, etc. And so as part of that kind of more policy-oriented work, which I did in 2015, 2016, I reached out to a lot of developers, right? And a lot of companies developing these tools, and didn't manage to talk to any of them because no one answered any of my messages. And that could have been a fluke. It happens. But in the meantime, I've had a range of students and younger colleagues who tried to kind of address the same question, and who also were basically stonewalled in a variety of ways. So like, some of the companies just never answer your emails. Some of them answer your emails and say that they're going to meet, but then they never meet. Some of them, meet but refuse to talk about anything. So there are like, a range of options, but basically didn't manage to get any information from interviews from the developers of these tools. And I don't know anyone who did, to be honest. So for example, Julia Engwin and her team then at ProPublica, now at the Markup, when they did this kind of quantitative audit of Compass, have to drink. Yeah, we'll drop it. So when they did this quantitative audit on Compass, which they did relying on FOIA requests, so which are Freedom of Information Act requests, where you can request some records it's like a specific procedures in the United States where the companies don't have to give their permission specifically. I mean, they're mandated to comply by law. So after they did that, they tried to kind of discuss with the companies that was building Compass, which at the point was North Point. Now it's Equivant. They kind of changed. Yes, they tried to kind of interact with them, but just didn't manage to get feedback, except very pretty kind of strident rebuttal after the publication of the article. So they basically corresponded through lawyers, is what happened. And so I think that this in itself is an important question, in the sense that it's something that a lot of the people who are studying digital technologies right now and algorithms and artificial intelligence are talking about, is that like a big part of their opacity actually comes from companies not having any, or feelings that they don't have any interest or any incentives to open up the box, right? And to kind of share the algorithms with researchers and with the public more broadly. And for sure, there are like major issues. It's like, for example, for my new research project, I try to get access. So my new research project is about influencers, and I'm doing a lot of research on influencers. So actually, Jonathan, I know a lot about the whole like unionization of influencers, because that's something I've been following pretty closely. And as part of this project, I've been trying to get people from major social media platforms to do interviews with me. And same thing, it's like, it's impossible. The best you'll get are like informal chats that cannot be recorded, that are off the record, and that cannot be used in the final research project. And here we're talking about an academic research project that's going to take a couple of years to be used, that's going to be anonymized, where it's like, I'm not the New York Times, so the kind of questions that I'm interested in are not even particularly sensitive, but it's just very, very, very hard to get access and to get information about what's going on within kind of the companies that are developing these tools. So now, the question is like, where do we go next? And I think that what's interesting about that, and that's where, like, going back to the fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics world, there are a variety of ways in which you can kind of bypass somewhat some of these questions. So first, like, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes some companies, for some kind of reason, someone will talk to you, and it's always a bit of a fluke. You're like, oh, okay, well, great. let's do this. But it really depends on like individual people, and that's like not super reliable. The second thing you can do is you can work with quantitative scholars and quantitative scientists and do kind of algorithmic audits, right? Where you basically crawl a lot of information or create sock puppets, like, basically try to test the algorithms a bit, for example, like what, again, Timnit Gebru and Joy Burlam-Winnie have done with the Gender Shades project, where they kind of tested facial recognition tools based on kind of using commercial tools based on the data set that they had constructed and seeing how the tools were performing. So, you can do audits like that. That's like a way in which you can do it. The third thing that you can do, which is I think what ethnographers are trying to do, is like try to get as much data as you can in a variety of ways, right? So you have this black box, which is a tech company, and that's a real pain in the butt, not to mince my word, but you basically try to get data all around it from like, all the angles around it that you can. And, it's better than nothing, I guess, is my kind of pragmatic view on this.
Kind of have
Interestingly, yes, Jonathan, yes, please go.
So I kind of have maybe a meta question about that. So in the kind of the research ethics, what are the guidelines you go to make sure that you're not re-perpetuating this kind of power dynamic as kind of an expert or this person who's kind of defining the truth or the reality for people outside of the industry? How do you make sure you do that? Because in the article I posted about the Mechanical Turk, one of the issues was you had people researchers who received money to research Mechanical Turk, and it ended up being very kind of stingy contractors for these issues. And what are the ethical guidelines there?
Yeah, so this is really tricky, right? And I think that I should mention here that it's also really interesting how a lot of the research on kind of fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in artificial intelligence has been funded largely by technology companies, right? And here I should add as a disclosure that I myself did a fellowship at Microsoft Research earlier this year, right? And so typically like places like Microsoft Research, places like Google Research, so, the recent events like kind of showed that, that was not to last, but and even like kind of YouTube, Facebook, etc., are like funding a lot of the research on this. And I think that it's always like a very complicated bargain, because on the one hand, you get access, right? So you get access to data, you get access to technology, you get access to developers. And because you're inside or affiliated with a technology company, other technology companies are more willing to talk to you. But as always, there is a trade-off, right? Which is that when you're on the payroll of a technology company, first, you're bound by some non-disclosure agreements. And second, you're co-opted. Whether you realize it or not, you are being co-opted, right? In a variety of ways. And you're here to make the technology company look good. That's how it works, right? That's how prestige and symbolic capital work. So that's something that I think every researcher studying technology should be very kind of reflexive about, and making sure that we both are transparent about it. For example, like I just did, by like disclosing when you get money from technology companies. I think it's something that we all have to be very transparent about, and kind of explaining what are the pros and cons and how it may affect judgment. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which is, about expertise. So, basically, ethnographic research and all research are fundamentally oppressive, modes of existence. And I'm thinking, ethnographic research in particular was developed really during the colonial realm. And it was a way for colonial powers to know the locals, to know the natives, right? And so they would basically externalize that work to anthropologists who were like, okay, I'm going to spend 6 months with the tribes, and I'm going to report with like findings that you guys can use to put them to work and to better regulate them, right? So there is this long history of participation and collaboration with colonial powers, and I think on the bright side that it's something that ethnographers and anthropologists have been mindful and aware of for now like a couple of decades, hopefully. And so I think that like it raises a lot of questions about ethics, accountability, how to position knowledge, and what's your role in the field. And so typically for me, I mean, these are small things, and it doesn't change the fact that like as an ethnographer, you're basically making a career on what other people who are not making a career in academia told you, right? And that's the thing with all academics. It's the same with quantitative social scientists who are like using data that people agreed to like fill in a survey, or are using big data by kind of relying on our digital traces. We're all exploiting the work of other people and making careers based on it, not giving credit to the people we're using. I mean, Antonio, I don't know if you agree with that, but like that's kind of my take.
We are paid way less than Google executives.
It's true. It's true. No, I mean, but it's always the same thing. It's like infinite regress. We're not the worst, but it's still extractive in a kind of way. Which, I mean, okay. So let me just finish on this. I think that there are ways in which you kind of try to make up for this, right? You make up for this in a variety of ways. First, you make sure that you don't put the people who agreed to share information with you in danger. So you anonymize the hell out of it. You make sure that there are no repercussions whatsoever. So that's a big part of, like, for example, what institutional review boards and kind of ethics reviews do, especially on American campuses, is kind of making sure that like you're not putting anyone at risk, which is like the baseline, right? It's like that's like the big no-no. Then the second thing that you do, and that I think I try to do, is I always rely on recordings. And that may seem like a small thing, but for me it is not, in the sense that I try to convey the precise words and expressions and worldviews of the people I study, and try to put this on the page. And obviously, like, then I put my own analysis and I put my own frame on it, because that's my job. But like part of what I'm thinking I'm doing is, like, to some extent, like making some of these voices visible. And when we're talking about the voices of judges and prosecutors, we may disagree that we're doing a service to anyone, and it's the same with policemen, right? It's like, I mean, but I think that in many other cases, what I do is also kind of try to like make the voices of users, the voices of workers visible in some kind of way. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is giving back. And so the question of giving back to the people you study and who generously agree to share information and data with you is a tricky one. And basically, there is no simple rule about it. It's always a very kind of individual negotiations, but that's something that I always try to do. So in some cases, for example, and that's kind of a recent thing for me, in some cases, I compensate my interview subjects when they're gig workers, for example. So that's the case with influencers. When some of them are just struggling and they have under a certain amount of followers, I offer compensation and I give them the choice to refuse or not. And I see that as a way, it's something that I didn't do with judges or with journalists, but in the case of influencers, I'm like, listen, you guys are hustling. And I'm taking some of your time, so I get it. You know what I mean? So that's one way. A second way is to offer to do free work for them, which is a lot of what I do. That, like, for example, I do unpaid internships with a lot of the people I study, and where, like, I put like 10 hours a week for 2 months, and I just, kind of work for free, basically. A third way is further down the line, if they're interested, to kind of either hire them as research assistants, or in some cases invite them as guest lecturer if they kind of want that exposure. So again, it's a variety of ways, but like that's something that I'm very mindful of, and that I think is like an important part of what it means to be a relatively responsible ethnographer, minimally responsible ethnographer, at least.
Thank you very much, Angèle. There is probably the final question, because we are heading towards the limit of our our conference, well, our actually webinar. I'm pretty sure that this question comes from a Brazilian participant, because it's actually for Jonathan and for myself, and I am addressed as Casilli, and only Brazilians call me by my family name, or people I went to the high school with. But in this case, I'm pretty sure that we can rely on this guess. Okay, Casilli and Jonathan, how do you see the place of translators / localizers in the internationalization of softwares and platforms? Because actually the point that this participant is making is that they are often unpaid, and for myself, I can say, yeah, sometimes they are unpaid, if it comes, for instance, to video games, who knows. But in many, many other cases, you think at big companies like Appen and Lionbridge, they have entire subdivisions that are devoted to localization and translation. And in this case, they are not unpaid, but they are micropaid, or well, paid less than a standard old-timey translator, you know, the ones that used to translate books. What about you, Jonathan? Do you have some insights on this?
So I think there's two kind of interesting questions. One is, we're talking about a kind of an entire industry that used to be a highly professionalized, highly maybe prestigious and highly paid, so translators. And the tech industry, like many other industries, has entirely replaced those industries and devalued the labor of translation. The other aspect, I think, is kind of the question of locality and what it means. So for the first part, I mean, I don't think there's any, you know, intrinsic rule of what labor is valued or which labor should be devalued. I think this is a question of, you know, with the globalized nature of capitalism and the availability of work, outsourcing is always going to be a threat, especially with online or kind of intangible work, so knowledge being one of them. There's nothing that's preventing, you know, the entire academic apparatus in the global north being replaced and outsourced. I mean, that's a real risk. And with translation work and this kind of intellectual work, that's definitely there. I think what's interesting is with localization in general, it's also raises this kind of question of authenticity of someone who's from the area or has that local expertise. And this adds, of course, value to whatever the said product is in the end. But also many times this is very invisibilized. So an example would be, we're talking about this whole conference about kind of algorithms and what is a fair or unfair algorithm. But when we're talking about platforms like Uber or other ride-hailing platforms, you know, the credit is kind of given to Uber or the engineers who wrote these algorithms, and we're kind of erasing the localized knowledge that a driver has, you know, where they're outsmarting or, you know, using their own discretionary judgment in what's a better route. So maybe they know that there's a road bump, but the Google Maps or the other maps haven't caught up with that. So in that case, you know, you have this local expertise or local knowledge, but it's not compensated, it's not valued.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that, okay, Joyful Self in the chat says that he or she is not Brazilian. So sorry, my bad.
Your algorithm
Anyways,
was ineffective?
I think, no, my own interpretation was, unfortunately. Okay, thank you very much. Listen, I think that if there are no other questions in the chat, we are at the end of our splendid session of this webinar, actually. I really want to thank for the time, patience, and generosity both Angèle Christin and Jonathan Miller. For Jonathan, thank you for spending part of your evening with us, and for Angèle, enjoy hopefully and luckily your afternoon in almost COVID, or towards COVID-free California, because as I understand, a lot of people are being vaccinated, and you see the light at the end of the tunnel. Unfortunately, here we are still way deep in the tunnel. And before we leave, I just wanted to again thank you, Odlone and the Gaieté Lyrique, for hosting this webinar. The next session of this cycle of conferences and of seminar will actually be on May the 20th with Shannon Valor from the University of Edinburgh, who will discuss technology's moral depth. I really recommend this presentation, this seminar. Shannon Valor is not only an ethicist, but somebody who has been developing the notion of the technology's moral depth, and you will see she will have interesting things to say, not only about the ethics of AI, but also how this conjugates with the specific and new apps like those that are tracing us via for COVID tracing, contact tracing via our smartphones or other devices. So again, thank you very much, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Angèle, Jonathan, Antonio, for such an interesting moment. As Antonio just said, so we will meet again for this seminar on May the 20th. But before that, I'll also invite you to a new lab just next Thursday, actually, for a whole day, during which we'll host the Sonic Urbanism Symposium organized by Theotrum Mundi and Iris at the EHESS again, and which this year is titled Crafting a Sonic Urbanism, and will address the question of non-human life forms and their activity in the production of urban habitats. So this will be a full day of presentations and performances rolling from 9:30 in the morning to 8:30 p.m. Until then, take good care of you, and thanks again for joining us tonight. If you missed the beginning, or if you want to see this session again, you will find it on the Gaieté Lyrique's website, their Facebook page, and their YouTube channel. So see you soon. Bye-bye.